Maurice Hobson, Associate Professor of Africana Studies and Historian at Georgia State University. Tonight, we will have a presentation by Dr. Eric Goldstein, who has written a book, The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity. Dr. Eric L. Goldstein is the Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory University, where he is also an Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies. He is the author of The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity, published by Princeton University in 2006, and the Deborah R. Weiner on Middle Ground, A History of Jews in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins Press in 2018. He is a former editor of the quarterly scholarly journal, American Jewish History. This particular presentation is a collaboration between the Atlanta Fulton Library Foundation and is in conjunction with the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American History and Culture. I'd like to present to some and introduce to others, Dr. Eric Goldstein.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be taking part in the One Book, One Read series. And I want to thank Victor Simmons and Morris Gardner from the Auburn Avenue Research Library and also the Fulton County Library System and Foundation for inviting me. And also thank you to Dr. Hobson for that kind introduction. So I'm here to talk a little bit about my book, The Price of Whiteness, and the larger topic of how Jews have fit into American society, and particularly the culture of race in the United States. The way that I usually describe my research is that I ask the question, what did it mean to be Jewish in a country that was largely defined by the categories of Black and white? I got interested in this topic as a graduate student at the University of Michigan, where I went to study both modern Jewish history and US history. And because there were very few students there interested in Jewish history, all of my introductory courses were in the US history area. And one of the things that I noticed immediately was, that race was really one of, if not the central defining theme in many of the works that we read in covering, the major works in US history. And as someone interested in ethnic life and group, minority group life in general, but with a specific focus in Jewish history, I was really, because of those readings, it really left me thinking about where do Jews fit into this larger story of race and racial division and racism in the United States. It was such a defining aspect of American history that this must have shaped their history, and how did the history of this small group fit into this larger story? So that really got me thinking about and on the path of my research. Central to my work is the idea that race is what scholars call a social construction, meaning that as a category, scholars in the last several decades have begun to think about race not as a natural biological category, as I think many people think of it, but as a social category, as a category that draws its meaning from particular social and cultural contexts, and that the idea has not always existed, but it's existed in certain societies and certain times, and particularly in the United States and other colonial settings, it took on a very important meaning and role. And I want to make clear that by saying that scholars think of race as a social construction, it does not at all mean that it's not an important or powerful category. In fact, as I said, it's been one of the sort of shaping ideas and categories in American life. But what it does is it allows us to think about it historically and to think about how ideas about race and concepts about race have changed and taken shape at different times in different ways and in different contexts. And the history of Jewish immigrants to the United States is a kind of helpful window into that process. I was just speaking to Dr. Hobson before the lecture, and he told me that one of his teachers was a scholar named David Roediger, who was one of the scholars that was writing at the time I was a graduate student. His work was very influential because he wrote about Irish immigrants and how when they came to the United States in the 1840s and 50s and in the 19th century, that they were often not always considered white, and that people spoke of the Irish race as a distinct race in certain contexts. And that book also got me thinking about, how was there a similar story with the Jews? And so one of the keys to my research is looking at the different ways that Jews were defined in American society over a swath of time, mostly from the 19th century into the late 20th century. And I found that with Jewish immigrants too, and I want to make clear that I'm mostly talking in this talk about Jewish immigrants that came from Europe. And this was the majority of the Jewish population in the United States. They came in a couple of different immigration waves, one from German-speaking parts of Europe in the middle of the 19th century. And then toward the end of the 19th century, a much larger wave of Jewish immigrants came from Eastern Europe, say between 1880 and about 1920. And during that period, about over 2 million Jewish immigrants came to the United States from Eastern Europe. So there are Jewish communities in other parts of the world. The Jewish population worldwide has been somewhat of a diverse population. But in the United States, the Jewish population mostly drew from those particular geographical areas until later in the 20th century when it became somewhat more diverse. So I'll return to that later. So for these immigrants coming to the United States in that time, I found that Jews too were often described in racial terms as, say, members of the Hebrew race or the Jewish race. It would not have been unusual to refer to Jewish blood or to describe Jews and some other European groups as having an innate set of character traits that was passed down from generation to generation and define them as essentially different from other groups. And that during this period, race had sort of multiple and sometimes overlapping meanings. And I want to make clear that there were a couple of different definitions of race. Just because Jews were described often as a race did not always mean that they were not considered white, that these could be kind of overlapping categories, and groups like Irish and Jews and Germans and other immigrant groups could sometimes be described in racial terms, but at the same time, they could also be considered part of a larger white collective. But what I found is that at different times in US history, these concepts could be slippery and could be changing, and there were times during which Jews were seen as different racially from the majority white population, and their whiteness was not always taken for granted, or it was at least put in doubt to some extent. Now, I want to make clear also that doesn't necessarily mean that they were considered Black, for example. It just means that they were considered a group who had a unique set of characteristics, and they did not always fit neatly into the system that was prevalent in the United States of dividing the population into whites and non-whites or people of color. And so sometimes Jews confounded the way that race was understood and talked about in American culture. So this is just a sort of a window into what I mean by saying that race is a social construction, that its meaning could be different in different time periods and settings. It could change over time. And Jews as a group whose definition changed more dramatically over time than some other groups kind of gives us a window into the way in which the larger cultural, political, and economic setting shaped different ideas about race in the United States. Okay. So my work is part of a larger literature that looks at, especially at these different European immigrant groups and how they came to think of themselves as white. And also to be accepted as white by the larger native-born dominant white population. As I think you'll see during my talk, I prefer not to describe that process as some other historians have. For example, there are books with titles like How the Irish Became White, or How Jews Became White Folks is the title of another book. I tend to look at it in a less linear fashion, certainly over a period of time as immigrant Jews from Germany and Eastern Europe became acculturated, became more, adapted themselves to American culture, rose on the social and economic ladder. They did learn about the American sort of way of race. They came to understand the culture of race, the categories of race that were used in the United States, and they did come to think of themselves as part of the white population, and over time they were accepted more clearly, less ambiguously as a part of the white population. But as you'll see, there were some ups and downs, and what I want to say is that to some extent whiteness could mean something different to people from this type of background than it might mean to someone from a different background. And with, for example, even in the last 10 years with the resurgence of some anti-Semitism in the United States, it just points to the fact that this process just didn't go in a straight line in which Jews became more and more privileged in the United States. They did become more privileged as they came to be accepted as white, but on the other hand, there could also be contrary movements at certain times. So I want to address that complexity a little later on. Okay, so I'm basically tracking the experience of Jewish immigrants in the United States roughly from the mid-19th century through the period of World War II. And then I'll say a little bit about what happened after World War II, which I consider a very important turning point. For me, there are two key processes that immigrant Jews encountered in the United States in grappling with the culture of race and the categories of race that prevailed in the United States. One is as they integrated into American society and sought greater acceptance, especially on the part of the dominant white middle-class native-born society into which they hoped to integrate themselves, they became more and more aware of the traditional way of thinking about race in the United States as a matter of black and white, or as a matter of white and non-white. And they recognized, the power that these categories had in defining status in the United States, that in many parts of the country, divisions, I'm sure as you all know, divisions between blacks and whites were a matter of law. In other parts of the country, although there weren't the same types of, for example, Jim Crow laws that existed in the South, these divisions were nonetheless enforced by custom in places like New York City and Chicago, where, for example, African Americans were segregated into different neighborhoods and institutions were not welcoming and so on. There was a kind of de facto segregation, even as there was a legal segregation in other parts of the country. And so as newcomers to this society, and also newcomers of a European background, where even if they weren't maybe accepted in all ways immediately, as I'll explain in a minute, there was at least a potential for European immigrants to be accepted as part of the white dominant society. So immigrant Jews learned about these racial divisions and the meaning that they had in American culture as they became part of American society and sought to become accepted within that society. And so one thread of my research is to look at how that process happened. How did that change over time? How did they both, in what settings and what time periods and what contexts did they come to understand the power and the force of these categories? And how did they change their behavior? How did they try to claim their status as white? To what extent did the larger society put pressures on them at particular times to sort of prove that they were white in order to gain acceptance? so that is one thread of my work. And then the flip side of it is that I look at how Jews defined themselves. What are the terms, what were the concepts that they used to understand what it meant to be Jewish? And as I explained earlier, in the 19th century, certainly, but also really throughout the period up until about World War II, Jews were not only sometimes referred to as a race by other Americans, but they often embraced that term as a way of understanding themselves, as a way of defining what it meant to be Jewish. From today's perspective, that might be confusing to some because I think popularly today, Jews are often understood as a religious group, but their history going back hundreds, even thousands of years, was one that in which they did not just understand themselves, and they were not just defined as a religious community, but as a broader social collective. In different settings, they defined themselves as a national group. They often, especially in the period before modern times, they often lived in segregated communities. They were different not only from the majority populations among whom they lived because of their religion, but because of their language, their customs, their just about, there were different laws that applied to them. They often only married within their group. And so their sense of difference went far beyond religion. And then in the modern period, when they had the chance to become citizens of Western states, not only in Europe, but the United States, and they started to become more socially integrated with the non-Jewish population, there was a sort of question that arose, well, what will it mean if they're socially integrated with a larger population? What will Jewishness mean? And so during this whole period, there was some wrangling, there was some debate about how Jews should define Jewishness in the modern world. And in the United States, that debate necessarily was shaped by the larger understanding of race and racial categories. One thing to understand is that the concepts that we have today, that terms such as ethnic group that are often applied to European groups like Jews or Italians, those terms did not exist at the time, and also that there was no concept such as we have today that would separate culture from race. So the term race was used to describe these different groups. And as I said, it didn't just indicate the way we might think of it today, that these were cultural groups, but that their cultural differences were seen as part of an innate set of character traits. It was a kind of a centralized way of thinking about the differences between these groups. As I said, and many times it didn't necessarily prevent them from being seen as white. So there were many times, for example, in the 19th century, especially at times when anti-Semitism was not particularly strong, where Jews proudly called themselves a race. In fact, because this was the way at the time of describing a sense of identity that went beyond religious identity. So when they were describing themselves as a community, as a group that was proud of their heritage, that wanted to tout their cultural achievements, they used a kind of racial language to understand, the nature of, what it meant to be Jewish beyond just the religious sphere. And I would say there wasn't even a neat division between the way they understood themselves as a religious group and a so-called racial group, because even their religious culture they saw as kind of emanating from the special, inherited character traits of their group. So it wasn't just an issue of their beliefs, but their traditions, even their religious traditions, as well as other traditions, emanated from their unique character as a group. And this whole package was defined and described using the term race. So the only problem is in the United States context, because race could sometimes have a slippery meaning, it could mean different things. At different times in US history, the definition of Jews as a race sometimes raised the question in certain contexts as to whether Jews were really could integrate into the larger white non-Jewish society. And this came up at certain times in US history. I see the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century as a particularly fraught time for immigrant Jews. And I want to show you some slides. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a minute. This is the cover of my book, which I'll speak about in a second. But so for example, particularly at this time, end of the 19th, early 20th century, there were a lot of concerns in the US about the rise of capitalism, the rise of cities, the rise of an industrial society. This was something that leaders of business leaders, political leaders, cultural leaders worried about the dramatic set of changes that were happening in the United States. And like in a lot of societies, when there are kind of endemic social anxieties, worries about the direction of society, they often find a minority group on which to project some of these fears. And if they could label some outsider group as being the real cause of these problems, then it would make them feel more confident and less afraid about these larger changes in their societies. And particularly because Jews were a group that had they had a particular history of being business people. Because of their particular history in Europe, they were often segregated into certain fields of work and industry. They were not allowed to own land or be farmers in many places. So they were associated in the popular mind with trade and commerce. So because these were topics of concern and worry in the United States, they often became the group in the popular mind, in the press. You see here a sort of a cartoon making fun of Jews as capitalists. It's a grandfather and grandson talking about the grandson tells the grandfather he went horseback riding and he sold his horse for $50. And the grandfather says, that good for you, Jakey, that is the way to enjoy horseback riding. And you can sort of see in this a projection on Jews as being kind of the prototypical capitalists, the people who are really concerned about making money and profiting, when really these were fears that many of the leaders of American society had about themselves during this period, and they're sort of using Jews as a foil to work out some of their fears and concerns. So this is an example of a time period in which the image of Jews as a kind of foreign race that has characteristics that were sort of different from and inimical to the white American character came shining through, because it was a time where the particular problems of American society made it convenient to label Jews and also to ostracize them to some extent from many of the social institutions of American life. So there's an example of how, although Jews were often proud of their group characteristics and sometimes embraced the term race as a kind of prideful description of their own group, there were also times like this, and this went on for quite a few decades, and it even got worse in the 20s and 30s, where it could be dangerous for them to use the term race to describe themselves. And so sometimes they shied away from describing themselves. And even though they may have thought of themselves in that more expansive way, they sometimes just used the term religion, for example, to describe themselves because they knew that would help them fit in and be accepted better within the larger white society. These are just some examples, some visual images of ways in which there were caricatures of Jews. This is from about 1903, a joke book of, quote, Hebrew jokes. And you see how not only in a sense of being people of a different character, but even physically, you see how this Jewish man is presented as someone with a very distinctive racialized physiognomy and with hand gestures and things that were thought to be distinctive of Jews. Here's something from a little bit later period, but it indicates how often these ideas about Jews being different than other white Americans could lead to them being excluded from certain clubs educational institutions, neighborhoods, and other institutions of the dominant society. So this is a anti-Semitic poster that was hung at New York University around 1923, and you see it refers to Jews as kikes, which it was a kind of racialized epithet that we don't exactly know the meaning of the word or where it comes from, but during this period it was a common word to describe Jews as a kind of undesirable group. And then at the same time, you see that this is also a way of questioning whether they're part of white society, because it says by getting rid of Jews that these people want to, quote, make New York University a white man's college. Again, I want to point out this doesn't necessarily mean that these people are saying that Jews are they're trying to impose on the one hand this black-white definition of race, but I don't want to suggest in this that Jews were sort of placed in the same boat in terms of the restrictions that they faced as, say, African Americans were, because in many ways, even during these periods of anti-Semitism, they did enjoy greater privileges. Their legal status as white was never seriously questioned in US law. But at the same time, there was a sense among white elites that Jews didn't really fit into white society and that they sort of were a different group. They just confounded the classic categories in American life of black and white. And this is just an illustration showing you how at different times Jews could also use the terminology of race in a very positive way. This is a cover of a Jewish magazine for women from 1895, and you see this very romanticized image of the, quote, Jewess, the female Jew, and she's depicted as a kind of Middle Eastern, they would have used the term Oriental beauty. And so there's a kind of assumption, you know, on the Jewish side as well, that Jews are a group that have certain physical characteristics. They put it in a more positive framework than the artist who did the joke book. But you see the complexity here that the Jews, because that was the term available to them, they did embrace in many cases the term race to describe themselves, and yet it could be dangerous. And so during this whole period, there was really a debate in Jewish society about whether they should use that term, whether they should use the term religion as a kind of means of assimilating into the larger white society and being less conspicuous and curtailing their definition of group difference in a way that would be more accepted by the larger white society. Here's another example of that. And I also want to say that there were many in the dominant white, among white elites who were very open to that, especially in the progressive era, the first few decades of the 20th century. There was, even as Jews were sometimes pointed out as foreign and alien, there was a kind of abiding faith among many leaders of white society, church leaders, political leaders, cultural leaders, that the Jews and many other European immigrant groups, although they may seem different and there might be some question about their cultural adaptation, that they would ultimately integrate into some kind of a melting pot, some kind of a white American melting pot. It might take time, it might take pressure, coercion, that they might have to be made to see the negative results of not conforming to the culture of the larger society and of being too different. But still, many white leaders at the time believed that Jews and other immigrant groups would ultimately melt into a kind of white American melting pot. And this is the picture from the cover of my book. This is the cabinet of President Theodore Roosevelt. And he was very much a proponent of this kind of melting pot idea. And he purposely appointed a Jew, Oscar Strauss, who you see here, number 3 in the row, and a Catholic to his cabinet, just to make the point that they could in time fit in and accommodate themselves to the lifestyle and become part of the white dominant society. And this picture was staged in this way just to make that point that they're all meant to look the same. So these are the two issues, right? That on the one hand, Jews, acculturating Jews as part of becoming American also felt some pressure to show that they were white and they fit into white America. But that at the same time, that sometimes raised questions about how they should define themselves as Jewish. If they wanted to be considered white, did that curtail the ways that were available to them to define their Jewishness? These are some examples and I'm going to say that there was a real spectrum in the Jewish community about how Jews approached both of these questions, depending on their particular origins, their context, their class status. But these are some examples of, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, how Jews in different parts of the country of different backgrounds tried to assert the fact that they wanted to be considered part of the white population. I've chosen some local examples just so, those of you, we're all in Atlanta, so this can help you put it in a local context. This is a postcard that I found that's actually in the collections of the Georgia State University Library. It's a very odd postcard. It's claiming to show a picture of a house in Atlanta if you see down here, it's labeled, it says, birthplace of first white girl in Atlanta, November 14th, 1848, Carrie A. Hass. Well, Carrie Hass, or Caroline Hass, was the daughter of one of Atlanta's first Jewish settlers in the 1840s. And it struck me as very odd, but also interesting and I found this claim that she, the daughter of German Jewish immigrants, was, quote, the first white girl born in Atlanta. I found this mentioned in histories of the Jewish community. I found it in the history of the temple, which is the oldest synagogue in Atlanta. And of course, in later years, the leadership of the temple was very associated with the fight for African-American civil rights. But in this early period, this was probably from the early 20th century, the Jewish community in a segregated Southern setting was very interested in showing the white powers that be that they were white and that they were not so different as to be excluded from white society. So they're making this historical claim that this baby born of these early Jewish settlers was actually the first white child born in Atlanta, because if you have in your community the first white child, then it sort of bolsters their claim that Jews are white. So they're sort of making this claim with this kind of historical legend. I found by looking in the newspapers that there were many different people who claimed to be the first white child born in Atlanta, but that's beside the point. The point is just that it's interesting that these immigrant Jews made this claim as a way, it's just an example of how they tried to assert their belonging in a society that was racially divided in the Jim Crow South. Now, just to show you that there's a spectrum here, if you look at a very different group of Jewish immigrants who arrived from Eastern Europe, and they came really out of a much more direct situation of persecution where they were victims often of violence in the Russian Empire. And they came to the United States in much greater numbers, and they had a much slower process of acculturation. So this is a cartoon from the Yiddish press. So I'm talking about a group of Yiddish-speaking immigrants who they were still speaking their native language. They weren't yet acculturated to American ways, and they were Jews who read these kinds of papers were probably living in much larger Jewish communities in places like New York. And unlike the family of Caroline Hass, they weren't yet feeling the pressure of fitting into a larger white society. And in fact, for East European Jews that came at a later period in the early 1900s, it would be a very long time. It would really be until the period after World War II that they achieved a measure of social integration and acceptance in the larger white society. So here you see a much more sympathetic, first of all, less of an interest in identifying as white. They, probably as new immigrants speaking Yiddish, they weren't even as aware of they were sort of aware of the categories of race in the United States, but they didn't feel the same pressure to identify as part of the white population. And so in fact, what they did is they identified as Jews who had come out of this situation of persecution, and they're viewing this these relations between white Americans and African Americans as kind of outsiders to that situation. And here they're lampooning American racism. The cartoon at the top says in Yiddish civilization, right? So they're saying, according to whites, and the subtext of this is there would be like a race riot in the United States where whites would attack African Americans. And in the Yiddish press, when they would report on this, they would call these attacks pogroms, which is the same term that they used to describe attacks on them in the Russian Empire. So they're viewing this very much through their own cultural lens. So they're kind of critiquing white racists in America and saying, well, when a white person attacks a black person, it's defined as civilization. But when a black person attacks a white person, it's called barbarism. That's the bottom says barbarism, right? So they're sort of critiquing the way in which these ideas of civilization and barbarism are used in the United States. And they're suggesting that actually whites aren't very civilized either because they attack and lynch African Americans. So, that it just is a window into how there was a kind of spectrum. It depended on how acculturated a Jewish immigrant was. If they were sort of newly arrived, they were still within their own cultural context, they might, and also considering their own particular history of persecution, they may be primed to be a critic of racism in the United States and to identify on some level with African Americans. But as they integrated more and sought a higher status in society and became more familiar with the non-Jewish white world, then there was a kind of process through which they began to understand and try to fit in and often to assert their belonging in white America. And this is another Atlanta example. This is a saloon on Decatur Street in Atlanta. And many Jews, especially in the South, where they often started as small merchants, they would enter often the economic, market at kind of the lower level because they were often poor, they didn't have a lot of capital. So they often in the South filled a niche of opening groceries and saloons and different stores in African American neighborhoods because that was a segment of the economy that wasn't as crowded as some others. And so here's an example of a saloon on Decatur Street that's owned by a Jewish immigrant, a Belsky. And then you see that it's a segregated saloon. It's in the window, it says colored only. And so in a way, this both shows their marginalization from this larger culture where they were willing to sort of cross racial lines and identify themselves as merchants in an African-American community. But it's also a process through which they learned about segregation and they learned about the racial etiquette and divisions within American society. And then as they rose on the economic ladder, they probably left behind this type of work, moved to a white section of Atlanta and identified more consistently as part of the white population. And then just to give you a totally different context, there were some very successful and wealthy Jews in the United States, like this is Julius Rosenwald. He was the owner of the Sears Roebuck Company. He's kind of an American success story where he, became very wealthy. And he became one of the most significant philanthropists supporting African-American education in the United States in the teens, 20s, and 30s of the 20th century. And here he is with Booker T. Washington. My read of Rosenwald is someone who was sort of in a third category, which is he certainly understood the conventions of American culture around race, but he also had sort of arrived. He was wealthy. He didn't have to worry too much about proving himself to anyone. And so in this case, whatever resonances in Jewish history there were that gave him a feeling of empathy for African Americans. And he certainly, he didn't oppose segregation, for example, and he didn't, I wouldn't say he was, a civil rights leader, but he did have a feeling of empathy and support for the African American community. And he funded a network of small schools across the South for African Americans. So really, it just depended on where an immigrant was in the process of acculturation, what pressures they felt. Did they feel pressure to fit in? Did they not feel pressure to fit in? And so Jews could have a spectrum of approaches in terms of how assertively they tried to demonstrate that they were part of the white population, and sort of where they fell on the spectrum of racial politics and racial issues. And then that, I'm gonna, just for time, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. And then, going back to the second part of my project, there was the same spectrum in terms of how Jews define themselves, that these two issues were kind of two sides of the same coin, that many Jews who were feeling the most pressure to fit in, who wanted to be accepted, were in those particular contexts. They were often the most skittish about defining Jewish group identity broadly and using racial terminology. And they often very strictly define Jews as a religious group, even if in their private conversations, for example, they might have defined it more broadly. But there were also situations in which Jews could not sort of shake the habit of defining themselves more broadly. And ironically, in periods of anti-Semitism, it could work both ways. In the 20s and 30s, there was a very intense period of anti-Semitism. And although there were those Jews who continued to hope that it would pass and they would be accepted into the halls of white institutions and white upper class society, and they narrowly defined being Jewish as a religion, there were others who responded to this by saying, this is how society sees us, so we should just turn it around and be proud of our Jewish difference. And they embraced a broader racial definition. This is just an example of a popular book I found. It's sort of like an encyclopedia of Jewish personalities. And there are people in this book that have maybe a very spectral relationship to Jewish identity or religious observance, but they're claiming all these people as Jews because of their descent from the Jewish community. So it's a kind of racial definition of Jews. So it's Moses to Einstein, right? They're claiming Albert Einstein as, proudly as a member of their group. And they're sort of suggesting that he demonstrates some kind of great qualities because of his Jewish heritage. And this was a kind of response to anti-Semitism. It was a way of saying, the larger society may deride us because we're Jews and say we're inferior or we're different or corrupt or greedy or whatever the stereotypes may have been. This is a way of saying, no, to be a member of the Jewish group means to have these great qualities that we're proud of. So that definition didn't really diminish until World War II. Just because this is local, I wanted to point out this picture of the Venetian Club pool in Decatur. I believe the club still exists today, but this was an example of a club in Atlanta that didn't admit Jews. Although, as I said, Jews had a much more significant degree of privilege in Atlanta, certainly as part of a white population, and yet they were still excluded socially before the Second World War, and even maybe a little beyond, from some of the most elite, social gathering places. So this was an example of a club and a swimming pool that didn't, Jews were not allowed to go there and swim there. So they had a kind of provisional status. There was an ambivalence about Jews, and in some ways they were accepted as white and they enjoyed the legal status as white. They weren't subject to kind of legal segregation. They didn't have to use separate bathrooms or water fountains. But in the informal society of white Atlanta, there were a lot of institutions, schools, clubs, places of employment where they were not welcome. And so this fed this larger dilemma, do they try to downplay their difference and keep hoping that they will finally be accepted into the ranks of white society, or do they just accept that they're different and highlight their distinctiveness? So I want to end by talking about the contemporary period, but I first want to just say that World War II was a big turning point. And, I think in large part because a lot of the problems and worries that fed anti-Semitism during the 20s and 30s diminished with the war, because the war brought on a much more prosperous economic period. The Great Depression was over. The United States emerged as a world power. So a lot of the fears and anxieties that had pushed many people to embrace anti-Semitism diminished, and there was a precipitous decline in anti-Semitism after World War II. And Jews had served in the military forces, and they were welcomed into the ranks of white society in a way that was much more substantial than in the pre-war period. So they were able to move to neighborhoods that would have previously excluded them. They benefited from the privileges that were extended to white soldiers to take advantage of the GI Bill and to get certain types of mortgages and move into white suburbs. And so and also educationally, a lot of the restrictions against Jews fell. And so a lot of the key institutions that they had been excluded from before the war, they now gain entry into. And I think this facilitated Jews being accepted much more solidly as part of white society. And also what you see after World War II is the Jews stopped using the term race to describe themselves. And to some extent that reflected their new social position within white society. And part of it was also a response to the fact that the Nazis during the Holocaust years used race in such a awful way to demonize and to justify the genocide of European Jewry. So race kind of vanishes from the Jewish lexicon as a term of self-description precisely at the moment in which Jews attain this level of social acceptance in white society. So 45 is a turning point, but I want to just say that I don't see it totally as a linear transformation. I want to say that I think in the post-war years, Jews continued to struggle with their place in the racial makeup of the United States. I think that in some ways, as a group, they embraced a certain style of racial liberalism, which allowed them to sort of continue to think of themselves as a group that wasn't quite like the rest of white America while still enjoying a lot of the privileges of being white in America. But there were times when if their continuing path of acculturation was threatened by, say, living in neighborhoods close to African Americans, they might also exhibit some of the racist tendencies of the larger white society. So it wasn't just a kind of linear development, but there were backs and forths. And the other thing is that although Jews sort of gave up this broader definition of themselves as a race, as a group apart from white America in some respects, and they largely defined themselves as a religious group, or they used other terms like ethnic group or people that became available after the war. But my sense is that that sense of a larger identity never went away, and that Jews have struggled with the constrictions of being a part of white society. That I don't at all want to say that I don't want to downplay the extent to which they benefited materially from the privilege that comes along with being accepted as white in America. But as a group, that came with certain strings, not to be too different, not to express your difference too strongly, or in terms that might be understood as upsetting the balance between whites and non-whites in the United States. So I think as you get to the end of the 20th century, you see a lot of anxiety and worry in the Jewish community about their survival as a group, their continuity, their being able to express their difference in a society which expected them not to be too different. That was the kind of price that I referred to, that becoming white entailed great benefits, but it also exacted a certain price in that they, as a group, they were not to be too different from the white mainstream. So whiteness continued to have particular consequences and meanings for Jews that were maybe different than what it meant for some other groups. So it's not just a kind of linear assimilation into an undifferentiated whiteness. And I just want to end a couple more minutes by just saying a few words about the last few years. And this also points to the way in which the relationship between Jews and whiteness is not just unidirectional. But I think a lot of people were shocked and surprised in 2017 to see this scene in Charlottesville, at a rally staged by white supremacists, by white nationalists who were drawn there because of a controversy about memorializing Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee. And so there was a clear element of white supremacy, of anti-Black racism in their, in what they were doing. And then as part of this rally, they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And I think that some people were sort of wondering, how does this all fit together? How does a group of white nationalists who are protesting the removal of Confederate monuments, how do they get Jews will, what does "Jews will not replace us" have to do with that? A friend and writer and activist, Eric Ward, who's the head of a group called the Western States Center in Portland, Oregon, who advocates for democracy and against racism, wrote a very interesting article in the wake of Charlottesville. It's called "Skin in the Game: How Anti-Semitism Animates White Nationalism," and you can find it online. And he made an argument about Charlottesville that sort of resonated with some of my own work. And he says that that these white nationalists, that anti-Semitism was actually an important part of their ideology, that they were white supremacists, that they had this ideology of whites being superior to African Americans and other people of color, but that there was, in that moment, in that period, there was a way in which their ideology didn't serve them in the same way that it traditionally had, because of the progress that African Americans have made in our society, the degree of leadership that they've displayed, that we had a Black president, that the civil rights movement had succeeded in many important ways, and it didn't sort of fit with their story that, African Americans are inferior to whites. And so anti-Semitism, wrote Eric Ward, played a role in their evolving ideology, because they argued that Jews had helped African Americans, and that African Americans had only made the strides that they had made with Jewish assistance, and the Jews were this kind of fifth column within white America. They appeared white, but they were really working behind the scenes to erode white supremacy, and that they were in collusion with people of color. We saw this also with the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre, where the gunman blamed Jews for aiding Mexican immigrants coming across the southern border. So it's another example of where a kind of racism that we're very familiar with against people of color kind of was intermingled with anti-Semitism, and that these two ideologies were kind of working together in the ideology of these recent groups. So Eric Ward says that his idea of skin in the game is that Jews today have a stake in fighting white racism and helping dismantle structural racism in the United States, because it's also fighting anti-Semitism, that these two things are linked. And I agree with that very much. I think my feeling today is that, to the extent that Jews, there's a complicated aspect where Jews, on the one hand, many Jews of European descent have enjoyed the white privilege to a large extent, and benefit from their membership in white society. But this also points out the ways in which they can also be sometimes vulnerable to anti-Semitism. And so it's, again, not just a linear development, but I also see in this a way in which they can use the privilege that they have to help, to be a positive force in helping dismantle the structures that also work against them as Jews. They may benefit them in some ways as whites, but they work against them as Jews. They foster anti-Semitism as well as other forms of racism. And what I would add to this, just to close this out, is that it's not only that Jews have skin in the game in fighting racism, because it's also fighting anti-Semitism. But part of my argument is that the expression of a broader, more robust Jewish identity has been constricted by the power that whiteness has in American culture, and that Jews will never be free of the pressure to fit in, to hide, to some extent, to downplay their distinctiveness, as long as they feel the pressure to demonstrate their membership in white society. And so if we can work to dismantle the structures of white racism and racial hierarchy in the United States, it will also provide a broader field for Jews and all cultural groups to express more fully their sense of difference and distinctiveness in American society. And that can't really happen as long as the United States is a society built around these racial hierarchies. So for these reasons, I see multiple reasons why Jews have skin in the game today to work against these categories, the power of these categories of racial hierarchy that have shaped our culture. I just, as one final thing, because I just want to show that I'm aware of this and this is an important trend, I want to go to this last slide that I have, which is that there's a growing population of Jews of color in the United States. That it's estimated, there are different estimates, but probably around 10% of the Jewish population today in the United States are people of color, and that percentage is increasing. There are some difficulties in that because most Jews in the United States are of European descent, and there's a kind of way in which it's assumed that all Jews are whites, that Jews of color sometimes have difficulties finding an embracing welcome in the Jewish community. But I just want to say that I think this is a very auspicious sign that as the Jewish community in the US becomes more diverse, perhaps whiteness and Jewishness can become disentangled from one another in a way that encourages the trends that I was just speaking of. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So we have witnessed a wonderful presentation by Dr. Goldstein. And, I couldn't help but think about David Roediger's book, The Wages of Whiteness, and Grace Hale's book on Making Whiteness, and the conversation around white ethnics. I mean, particularly Italians, Greeks, Germans, and different white ethnics. And Dr. Goldstein has provided us a very illuminating presentation about the experiences of Jewish people. I have several questions here, and then I formed a question and you partially answered it, but I think I could spin it to do something else with it. The first question is, how has the ambiguous racial identity of Jews benefited their lives in the US? And then there's a follow-up question, how has it made it more challenging or even dangerous? So the first, how has the ambiguous racial identity of Jews benefited their lives in the US?
Right. So I think, first of all, the word you're using to describe it, ambiguous, is exactly right. That sometimes in this literature about immigrants and whiteness, it's presented as the immigrants were considered non-white, and it's sort of, and I think the assumption is Irish and these groups were considered sort of to be in the same boat as African Americans, as being racial others. And then at some point they came to be accepted as white. And I would say, I don't think it's exactly like that. I think that, at most they were considered ambiguous. I think it'd be hard to argue that any of these groups at any time faced the same level of discrimination and that their rights were challenged to the extent that African Americans and other people of color's rights were challenged. So I think when you're in a situation of ambiguity, just like you say, there are dangers, but there is also a sense of possibility. And just to take a group that I've studied a lot, Jews in the US South, I think they experience some dangers. Like, for example, we have the case of the Leo Frank lynching that happened in 1915. It's considered a major example of anti-Semitism in the US. On the other hand, if you compare it to the lynching of African Americans, there were hundreds of lynchings of African Americans. There was a single lynching that we know of a Jewish person. Yet for Jews who were in an ambiguous situation, they were very much trying to be accepted in the dominant white society. So for them to experience that, it was it created a fear that all of their hopes for acceptance and upward mobility and integration were not going to work. But in the long run, most of the time, that's an example of the danger, but most of the time they were able to have a feeling that if we only do our best to fit in, if we only prove our good citizenship, if we only prove that we are good exemplars of the larger culture, then we believe that we will be accepted and win all of the benefits of being part of the larger society. So there was, I would say that was more common in the long run, a kind of abiding faith that if only we work hard and do our best and fit in and don't appear as challenging the beliefs of the larger society, that we will win acceptance for that. It's just that there were sometimes difficult moments. Another moment I would say is at the height of the civil rights movement, not everywhere, but in certain places like in the Mississippi Delta, there was tremendous pressure on Jews to not be different in any way. And unfortunately, it led to some, people in that area, for example, joining in the larger white consensus, against civil rights and against integration. But in other places like Atlanta, you saw counter examples. So it really depends on, where you were. But it's that ambiguous status. It could have different results. I like to say there was not one predictable outcome of being Jewish where you would land on racial issues. That being in that ambiguous situation in some types of cases could push you to want to show that you were part of the larger society and so adopt the mores of the larger society. And then in other cases, it maybe pushed them to identify with other outsiders. And if they could do it in a way that didn't threaten their basic security, perhaps to support and identify with other marginalized groups. But it really just depended on the particular social circumstances, the particular time period in which they found themselves.
Well, that's an excellent segue into the next question. And that question is, how does the cultural context of Jews impact the ways in which they consider questions of race in the US? And then there's a follow-up. Why might Jews in different parts of the country have different ideas around race? And I think that last part really speaks to what you were just discussing. Right.
So just as an example, in 1903, well, actually in 1898, I'm sure as a historian of African-American history, you know about the Wilmington massacre in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. A massacre of African-American citizens by whites there. And it attracted a great deal of comment nationwide. And of course, in the North, there was much more sympathy for the victims. And the Jewish press in the North criticized and decried the massacre. And particularly this newspaper, the Philadelphia Jewish Exponent, compared this massacre with the massacre of Jews in the Russian Empire. And they said something like, we of all people who suffer this type of violence in Russia, we should be sympathetic and decry this type of massacre on our own soil in the United States. And then a Jewish newspaper from Richmond, Virginia, replied to them and said, you don't know anything about race relations in the South, and Jews are not like African Americans. And they basically endorsed the local thinking about, differences between African Americans and whites. And those Jews could have been of very same background as the Jews in Philadelphia who were writing the opposite thing. But it just shows how regionalism really played a role. And because they were living in a society where their acceptance and they're also merchants, they're dealing with the non-Jewish population as their customers, they rely on them for their livelihood. So they felt, they were not only shaped by their environment, I think, they weren't just saying this just to please their neighbors, but they had imbibed these ideas, but they were in a very different environment, and being a part of larger society pushed them in that direction. Whereas in Philadelphia, in a quite different environment, Jews couldn't help see that there were similarities between their history and Black history and experience. And so it's just amazing how two groups of Jews in different states could interpret the same event in such an opposite way. So that's why I say there's no one predictable.
Absolutely.
You can't just say, because you're Jewish, you would see it this way. Being Jewish meant something different in North Carolina than it did in Pennsylvania.
That is, I think we have time for one more question, and that's an interesting segue to this last question. As a professor, as a historian of African American and American history, I see all of the parallels between the Black experience and the Jewish experience in America. Case in point, during World War I, American patriotism not only fueled anti-Black racism, but xenophobia towards white ethnics, particularly Jewish and German communities, because of the fact that the Germans had bombed the Lusitania and the whole nine and brought the US into World War I. However, in recent society, there has been a groundswell of racism that not only targets Black communities, but also Latinx and Asian communities as well. How has this fared for the American Jewish communities in terms of this? And I wanna, you answered part of it before with the Charlottesville incident, but one of the things that I want us to consider is violence is pervasive in American culture. And there have been a lot of attacks on synagogues most recently. What I'm saying is, it's been so recent, and I can't remember when the last attack was, when the rabbi, they were able to run out of the back of the temple.
Yeah, in Colleyville, Texas.
Right.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if that was in 2022 or at the end of 2021, but it just shows the amount of violence, how pervasive it is in the society. Can you talk about the violent aspect of things and the ways in which Jewish communities have been
right,
have sounded the alarm for protections?
Well, I think one thing is that right now we're in a period, a particularly kind of traumatic and difficult period in American history, where racial hatreds have become even more intense than they have in some other times. And I think this is one of the moments when you see anti-Semitism flaring, it often suggests that I think there's a kind of more conventional way of thinking about racial division that focuses on categories of color. And I think, as the work of Eric Ward suggests that I mentioned, that there are moments, though, that among white racists, that traditional way of thinking doesn't quite suffice to address the deep sense of anxiety and self-doubt and sense of division and so on that is somehow animating them. And in those moments, anti-Semitism can come in as a kind of additional way of thinking that mingles with these other forms of racism. But it's a period in which I think kind of I see it as a kind of moment in which, when you see those people marching in Charlottesville, where there's something where just distinguishing whiteness and blackness, or whiteness and people of color, doesn't suffice. And there's a feeling that whiteness itself is kind of under attack and is breaking apart. And they look for enemies within to explain some of the things that they can't explain using their conventional ideologies. So I think there's certain times in US history where anti-Semitism flares for that reason. And I think, it just reminds us that although, and again, this is not at all to discount the degree of privilege that people who can identify as white enjoy, but that there are some complexities, and that Jews at certain moments can be victimized despite the fact that they may enjoy a certain place on the socioeconomic ladder, or they may enjoy certain privileges as whites, but that didn't fully protect them from these individuals from the violence that you saw in Pittsburgh and some other places in recent years. So I think we always have to keep that complexity in mind, that that there are different understandings of difference and racial hatred, they're not all the same. And that we should not always make kind of simple distinctions between who has power, who has privilege. And yet at the same time, we can't totally ignore those very important structures which have shaped American society. So it's very hard, right? Because you have to just appreciate the complexity, that it's not one or the other. And for Jews, for example, it's not that, you know, are they privileged or are they not privileged, but to understand kind of the complexity of their situation, that in many ways they are privileged and they do enjoy the privilege of whites in the United States, but that's not the whole story, and that they still can be vulnerable in certain moments to very extreme forms of violence. Anyway, it's just very complex.
For all that are listening, you have just witnessed a great presentation by Dr. Eric Goldstein, who presented understandings of his work, The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity. This production has been brought to you by the Atlanta Fulton Library Foundation and the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American History and Culture. We hope that you enjoyed it. We're putting this particular book and others in context with Isabel Wilkerson's Caste. So thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you soon.